Hello, welcome to the first session of Catechism for Revolutionary Philosophy by Reza Negarestani. In this 8-session seminar, we shall entertain a profound puzzle, not only regarding the nature of time, but also concerning radical constitutional transformation and revolutionary subjectivity. That is, the crisis of social and political leadership in the contemporary West. This represents an infinite dilemma, a forking blade, a criterion raised against the vagaries of the self-subjectivity and the oppressions of those who have succumbed to these vagaries throughout history. This culminates in the rise of the contemporary Western political landscape, echoing by a bygone colonialism. Europe that, even before fulfilling its dream to annex the globe, was already conquered by forces of the other. The central puzzle we will address is this. Which came first, the decentralized society or the crisis of transformative leadership? The seminar does not indulge in approaches originating from either the canonical left or the right. The primary focus is to construct and hone a framework, a blueprint for a leader, a revolutionary subject, an open source self that can unite and mobilize without succumbing to the pathologies of selfhood and the forms of collectivity built upon. These pathologies include not only messianic or effective altruist pretensions, but also those born of individual and social traumas. Hysteria's post-leadership crisis won't help us much. The aim of this seminar is to casually formulate a set of criteria for a leader, a true philosophical human being who can be an open source, democratically constructible, and fully reflective self. A self that may consist of no one, but nevertheless stands up to the end of its life and its time. In other words, this is leadership as the mobilization of time infinite practical reasons. Leadership as the way of galvanizing self-determination and the progression of all humankind. Leadership that has never been so rare to emerge and never so in dire need. Such philosophical human beings, these potential leaders, signify what it is to adopt a set of practical reasonings, and indeed a concrete self-consciousness that does not bottom out in the here and now. A movement that does not die down before the next generation join it. Hence, the Catechism here is only a set of bracketing questions regarding the nature of who is a true leader and who is hysterically over, or narrow-reactionary concerning the possibilities of leadership, the possibility of leadership notwithstanding. In other words, the open nature of leadership is that which challenges both the well-worn orthodoxies advanced in the name of oppression and exaggerations about a messianic all-God yet to come. Accordingly, in each session, we work in the spirit of critique, research, and lab work on particular leaders or revolutionary philosophical human beings, mainly originating from Iranian history. These names are mere prototypes with shortcomings of their own, to be synthesized and reconstructed with care and criticism by all participants according to their specific contexts of social and historical consciousness, background and struggle. Ali Muhammad Shirazi, Tere Kuhat Alim, Mirza Kusha Khan, Ibrahim Khan and his daughter, Hastig, Bihan Janazi, Ali Shariati, Akbar Gudazi, and Mina Keshwar Kamal. Reza Negarestani is a philosopher. He has contributed extensively to journals and anthologies and lectured at numerous international universities and institutes. His current philosophical project is focused on rationalist universalism, beginning with the evolution of the modern system of knowledge and advancing toward contemporary philosophies of rationalism, their procedures as well as their demands for special forms of human conduct. He is the author of Cyclonopedia and Intelligence and Spirit. I'm now going to pass the mic for Reza.
Thank you, everyone. It is great to see some familiar faces and a lot of new faces. I'm humbled and thankful to you all. So, first and foremost, I just want to make a number of points about the seminar. And then before passing the mic to you, such that you can introduce yourself. First thing, this course, as I mentioned before the recording, is by all definitions, is not about a specific topic, even though the description, which has been changed a number of times for pragmatic reasons, appears to give you that sort of impression. We can think about this seminar as a matrix of interconnected concepts which allow us to think about a certain sort of practical wisdoms or practical reasons, thinking about our own, wherever you are coming from, our own calamities and our own environment and social context, socioeconomic context. Obviously, it appears on the surface that there is a move or an advance toward a certain sort of localism, by putting emphasis on Iranian history, modern Iranian history, and essentially selecting some protagonists or imams. This is another change that I mentioned. We do not essentially deal with leaders, and for good reasons, in the Western canon, or leadership in the Western canon of understanding of what a leader or leadership means, but imam, a teacher, a guider, a pointer, so to speak. We are dealing with these figures or protagonists insofar as, if I want to be completely honest, frank, yet confident about the course of history, I can only think and talk about the course of history in which I have come from. And then it is up to you to replicate, but not mimic, and synthesize your own protagonist, your own teachers and guides for collectivity and collective action. In a sense, it is imperative for me to make two moves at the same time. One, which I have never taken before, because I'm a universalist, a rationalist, right? And I would be happy to truly introduce myself as a philosopher of enlightenment. I mean, people might say, well, enlightenment is a Western agenda, but that is something that I want to fundamentally challenge. Regardless of that fact, it is imperative for me to go back to the origins. By that, I don't mean foundations or land or nation or hereditary and blood and so on and so forth. But the origins, the science of origins, as philosophers usually have talked about this, to a certain sort of concrete a specification of where I have come from. And that is, a move that I've never taken before, and I think is necessary. So this move downward to the concrete particularism, or a specification, as a better word for it, precisely because a specification underlines a relation between the specific and that which is specified, and that which is specified is usually considered to be objective, not that it is fact, objective fact per se, but nevertheless, in the historical context, it is taken as something objective. Of course, it can be renegotiated, and hence the specificity of the situation will change. So I need to go to the specificity of my own situation, which, of course, would be a Muslim, right? Whether you call it a heretic Muslim, a radical Muslim, doesn't matter. Nevertheless, a Muslim, whether I like it or not. A Muslim, an Iranian, and, being, by definition, the child of revolution. And by that, I mean a series of events that happened in my country from the beginning of 20th century, starting with the constitutional revolution of Iran, unfolding through a series of minor revolutions in thought and practice to 1979 Iranian Revolution, sometimes understood by Western commentators as the most unlikely and the most uncommon revolution of all, insofar as the Iranian Revolution did not chiefly follow the pattern of other revolutions that had came before it. Meaning that the causes of revolutions did not arise from extreme disparity, extreme unpopularity of the government, war, so on and so forth. This is why 1979 Iranian Revolution is considered, or it is titled as the most unlikely of revolutions. How can a form of Islamo-Marxism, or a form of Islam, more precisely, create a revolution which is major? I do not know that much about whether Iranian Revolution is actually the most uncommon revolution. I think there is an exaggeration in this. And I will, in fact, try to criticize this against people like Foucault, who wrote about the Iranian revolutions, and many others. But nevertheless, I know for the fact the Iranian Revolution was and is the last major planetary revolution on the globe. Right. It is the last major revolution that we know of. From a historical dialectical perspective, obviously, being the last major revolution, major planetary revolution, should give us a number of lessons, a number of pointers, a number of essentially themes about the success and failures of revolution, such that if a next revolution happens, we should take absolutely, for good reasons, practical and otherwise, Iranian revolution very, very seriously. So, yes, this is the reason for my move downward, right, to a concrete particularity, namely a specification of my own thought. Thoughts which have been so far unconscious or subconscious for me as a philosopher, as a proponent of enlightenment. Now, of course, the move downward should be coupled with a move upward. And that would be the true complementary and the sufficient expression of a revolutionary philosophy. The move toward the indigenous, concrete context ultimately is meaningless without a move upward toward universality. But you might ask, well, universality also has elements of Western Enlightenment, Western idea of instrumental reason, colonialism, and so on and so forth. But no, first and foremost, we can in fact, and I'm going to, during the course of this seminar, talk about this, that we can in fact distinguish the legacy of universalism as a historical enterprise from the history of the West and its universalism. Meaning a universalism that has, I would say, since most probably since the mid-20th century has come under massive amount of criticism. For good reasons and also for extremely bad reasons. To such an extent that even the slightest mention of universalism can get you cancelled. Simple as that. For you to advance the agenda of universalism means that you are advancing the agenda of the oppressor. And its vision of theoretical and practical reasons, namely the dominant class ideas. But I want to say that this is absolutely not true, even though there is a grain of truth to it. That in fact, we can distinguish a universalism which is lean, which is minimal and mobile, and without which that movement that I mentioned, the movement downward toward the concrete specification of my own existence, nafs, khishtan, khud, selfhood, would be a complete reactionary lip service to the agenda of global neoliberalism as it spreads its tentacles over the globe. And hence, there comes with this idea an obvious criticism of certain tenets in Western civilization, whose proponents come from essentially our neck of the wood, third world countries, global south, and so on and so forth, which we call them subaltern studies, post-colonial studies, and so on and so forth. Without dismissing the entirety of their argument, we want to say that the move downward without a lean agenda of universalism, a necessary agenda of universalism, which I would say can both serve for concrete universalism and as a regulative idea, any sort of appeal to indigenousness, to the subaltern, will ultimately serve neoliberal global order and nothing more than that. It would absolutely go hand in hand with the resignation. And there is no cardinal sin greater than resignation when it comes to revolutionary practice than resignation. Because resignation is not just resignation in imagination, but resignation in practice. Right? And in that sense, the resignation enabled by the sort of appeal, unconditional appeal to localism, to the particularity, to the specified concrete matrix of our own upbringing and our own history, in a very twisted sort of way, always globally serves, the aims of a soft capital or soft capitalist encroachment. By soft capitalist encroachment, I mean essentially the creed known as liberalism. Liberalism of the old or new. The whole point of neoliberalism is the creation of a certain sort of world system, global system, in which the facade of freedom is being fabricated through deep structure of material capitalist manipulation, such that precisely we think that we are autonomous, that we are self-determining in our own localist agendas of revolution, but ultimately, or communitarian separation from the world capital, but ultimately we serve the aim of a global system so insidious and so fundamentally militant in its complete accretion and its complete functioning that it does not actually give us any sort of reprieve from this world. We are merely thinking that, we can recreate ideas of justice and freedom, right? Mimic the ideas of justice and freedom at a local level, and that is sufficient, and that is a force of resistance against the capital. And the only way that we can move forward is by merely trying to scale up this force of subaltern force of resistance, right? Scaling up. Essentially, neoliberalism in this sense is a very insidious idea, precisely because it's a one-pony trick. If you think about this, it is about a scaling up or a scaling down problem. It tries to, without any sort of attention to the material conditions and the specific scale sensitive practices, tries to scale up or down ideas of freedom, self-determination, choice, free will, so on and so forth. To this extent, it is not actually that much of an exaggeration to say that in a certain sort of way, the mere appeal to subaltern, right, and to the concrete specificity of local agents can only end up to serve the ends of capitalism, in the sense that capitalism in its new world order absolutely doesn't care whether you pray in a mosque or you pray or you take a break from your work and pray. You are in Wall Street or in Singapore and Bangladesh, in a factory or the equivalent of the Wall Street of United States, and you take a break and pray on the street. It doesn't care whether you are circumcised or not. It doesn't care whether you wear veil. Ultimately, when you come to the street, going to Louis Vuitton store or not. No. It actually tries to masquerade this diversification, this slight diversification, not in a fundamental radical sense, in a very manner of superficial deviation from practices of global hegemony of capital. It tries to essentially propose or show or exhibit and display such deviation in practice as modes of resistance. That no, yeah, look at these people, look at these Muslims. They are in factory. In China, they're creating MacBooks. And they are, look at these poor Muslims. They are going to take a break. And even China, which is a fundamentally trying to persecute Muslims. Even China allows them to take a break, go on a street, pray, and then come back to their work. And you see, they would say that, well, this is a local resistance. You see, they have already put up a local resistance. But this, as we know it, this is not a local resistance. Merely a small deviations or perturbations enabled by local practices, by indigenous practices, are not sufficient to essentially counter capital practices. Any person, I would say, who believe in such myths essentially ultimately give lip service to a far more insidious version of capitalism, which is all over the world. That insofar as the tendencies of capitalism are fully universal, and that cannot be countered effectively by local indigenous practices, we should also think about universal ends for leftist emancipatory practices. So universalism of the sort that I'm talking about, as I mentioned, is lean, is mobile, precisely because ultimately it is so basic and in fact so elementary that I don't think that any of us, any person coming from the global south or the third world would actually contest and disagree with the existence, not only the existence, but also the priority of such agendas. These are the agendas of the human being, simple as that. So universalism, true universalism, originate from the real consciousness of what it means to be human. I mean, the only things that we know and people have talked about in terms of this lean universalism, and I think that a number of other stuff can be attached to it to make it even more concrete and determinate, is that isn't it the case that all humans are actually concerned about their well-beings? Not only their well-beings, but also self-determination. That I need to have a voice in how my well-being is being addressed, right? And then the third one, which is the most important one, which I think is a discovery of Marxism, the practices that go into the preserving of the well-being, right? Aren't you concerned about the practices that your society puts into the preservation of your well-being, even though they might appear as if they are about preservation and maintenance and continuation of well-being, but they might not be, right? This is the role of the apparatus. The apparatus, meaning an organization or an institute, a dispositive, can appear as if it addresses your well-being on the level of practices, but ultimately these practices, number one, might not actually create a well-being for you, but only a mirage of well-being for you. And not only that, they might create truly a well-being for you at the expense of other humans. Yeah. So obviously, these are the concerns of the universalist agenda. Freedom and justice are indifferent to where you have come from. Whether you are coming from the Middle East, whether you are a Jew, a Muslim, a Christian, whether you are African, whether you have come from the pit of oppression, whether you have come from Cambodia, where the calendar was switched to year zero, it does not universal agendas, such as judgment and freedom. And of course, we can talk about this, how much they are Western and how much they are not. These agendas are ultimately, truly, fundamentally lean, regulative ideas which make up the idea of universality. But this universality is yet abstract and indeterminate. So first and foremost, the vector downward, the move toward the concrete specification, with the understanding that a specification is a relation, it's a relational sort of thing. It's not Deleuzian, it's not non-relational, it's not a singularity, right? Or a process of singularization. A specification is a relation between a specific and a specified. A specified is the objective norm, which can be obviously renegotiated by change in the specific, which are literally us as subjects. Once we go back to our origin. So it is a move toward the concrete particularity, the concrete specification. The move upward is toward the lean universality. A universality that only assumes that which, regardless of where you have come from, you still want these. As I said, those criteria and the questioning of those criteria. We all question those criteria, and by virtue of which we have a certain sort of commonality. This is how revolutions get exported, through universalism, but not through localism. And then we move, then when we try to synthesize this vector downward and vector upward from concrete particularity of our own existence as subjects to these sort of lean yet semi-determined, but not fully determined, universal agendas, this would be the task. The synthesis between these two vectors is create a concrete universality. And concrete universality in the sense of how we synthesize our local particularity with a number of agendas, universal agendas, which we all share, regardless of where we come from, is the course of a true revolution. Now, you might say that how this revolution can be conducted, how it can be truly take a concrete shape. Because revolution, obviously, we can think about it, even in the sense of I've gone to this indigenous context, and then I'm trying to synthesize this indigenous context with certain sort of universal, indifferent, impersonal agendas. But nevertheless, this is still something that happens in thought. This is what we call ideology in a good sense. And ideology is important. And I'm going to emphasize why ideology is important throughout the course of this seminar. Ideology is not false consciousness. Ideology is essentially a vector of theoretical practices that allow us to think about the horizon, where we have come from, and where we ought to go, where we ought to move towards to. But this is still something, as I mentioned, that it happens in the realm of ideas, in the realm of thought. Mostly it is in our head. Then how can we turn this into a practice, a practical philosophy? I don't want to talk about political philosophy. It is not my expertise. I want to talk about political philosophy as a species of practical philosophy. And this project that I just mentioned is a species of practical philosophy, right? Of how this synthesis that is in your head can be transplanted into the realm of practice. For this, what sort of things do we need? What sort of practices? And of course, practices are not just, free-floating things. Practices are entrenched in material conditions, but also in thoughts, in cognitions, theoretical cognitions. And to that extent, I want to propose that one, but it is not essentially the only thing, that one of the things that we require for this transition from this idea of revolution in your head to the idea of revolution in practice would be I don't know how to say this in English. There is a great word in Farsi and Arabic about this, but rather for now, and we can come back and criticize the word in English later on. It would be the upbringing and nurturing of a revolutionary philosophical human being, otherwise known as Imam. In Western canon, this is usually called a leader. But of course, there is a massive amount of, when we translate these two, even Imam, we are going to criticize about the whole idea of the Imamism and Imamology as we move forward. But the idea of leader is even more what you might call to be rife with misinterpretations. Precisely because the idea of leader comes from a certain sort of idea of sovereignty, rule, and law, which are attached to it in the Western canon. For now, we can simply think about these as guides, a certain sort of revolutionary subjectivity, which would be able to transform that which is in your head, other ideas, into that which is in society, its institutes, its organization, and apparatuses. So these are nodes which, or translators, which essentially enable the transition from the theoretical idea of practice to practice, which has already fully, concretely, as its engine, as mobilization, the theory itself. But it is no longer mere theory. It is no longer mere theoretical cognition or theoretical wisdom. It is actually practical wisdom, which Aristotle called phronesis. And to that extent, these nodes are not actually traditionally understood as philosophers. Philosophers are usually the harbingers of theoretical wisdom. But we know that philosophers historically don't have a good reputation, if any at all, about their exercise of practical wisdom. In fact, it is the case that the majority of philosophers, namely the proponents of theoretical wisdom, in real concrete historical context of their own time, have been goddamn tyrant lovers. Since Plato onwards. Right. This is why I'm not Aristotelian, I'm a Platonist. But I think that one of the greatest criticisms that Aristotle levied against Plato was exactly about this, about the lack of a portion of your own brain as an individual, as a philosopher, the philosophers lack. Philosophy in its traditional sense, I would say, is tantamount to an immature or prematurely developed brain. Literally, this is what Aristotle talks about. What is this immature part of your brain for philosophers? It's the idea that they don't have sensible practical wisdom. Right? They have ideas, and these ideas do pertain to practices. It's not the free-floating. It's not as if they're just the idealistic. So the whole charge is levied against Plato and Platonic tradition as this sort of subjective idealism and this sort of unhinged idealism is completely untrue. No, ideas about practice. But precisely because these are ideas about practice, they are necessary, absolutely necessary, but they are not sufficient for them being thinking about, and this is the blind spot of these ideas about practice in the tradition of philosophy, that they have a fundamental blind spot about the practices that go and make the ideas about practices viable and, interesting or essentially viable. So the blind spot of a philosopher is literally, from a Marxian perspective, is the unconsciousness, or what you might call to be if you want to be less Freudian and more Platonic, less emphasis on the idea of the origins about where our ideas about practices are coming from. Where obviously, from a Marxian perspective, not only ideas, but also practices come from material conditions that involve certain practices. And this is, for Aristotle, is the idea of phronesis, right? Practical wisdom. Practical wisdom pertains to that portion of the mind which tries to think about where do my ideas of practice and other ideas come from, where obviously they come from certain sort of practices that have one leg in concrete practices as such, and ideas and practices, right? Such as, for example, the idea of giving and taking, the idea of rationality, giving and taking reasons, or the idea of doing literature, doing poetry, doing philosophy. They might appear as if they are merely theory mongering practices, but they are actually practices, except that they are very contextualized. So the whole idea of phronesis wants to address this idea that there are, we can say that there are a strata of practices, and these are usually in Marxian sense we can call them modes of exchange, not modes of production, but modes of exchange, because mode of exchange actually does, in fact, precede the mode of production. Modes of exchange, meaning practices of certain sort of elementary form which precede practice of thinking and practice as such. So in that sense, in this seminar, we want to also think about these practices, these modes of exchange. And what does it mean for us to move from, determinate local context to these, universal agendas, moving this toward a concrete universalism as opposed to a concrete localism, this would require for us to actually think about modes of practices, phronesis, practical wisdom. A practical wisdom that is necessary for this transition to happen. And I would say, not only in Marxism writ large, but also in the canon of universal religions, there are good indications as what or who might be the facilitator of this transition from this side of two vectors of downward and upward to a fundamentally concrete universalism, precisely because these philosophical human beings, these subjects, are no longer thinking in their heads, even though they are going toward the concrete, context of where they have come from. No, they actually think about moving to the origin and synthesizing it with the universal agenda in terms of practices which can be proliferated, synthesized, and exported across nations, states, and ideologies. This practice of exporting practices to the full achievement of concrete universality is none but the very practice of world revolution. So this is more or less the framework of the seminar. And of course, the sort of failures that come from this. I think that failures should be taken very seriously and not should be used as an excuse to derail such ambitions in thought and practice. But rather, we are in the business of practice. If we are in the business of practice, we should learn from failures as pragmatic, in the American sense of pragmatism, as pragmatic rectification of our own ignorance, mitigation of theoretical and practical ignorance with regard to such topics. Hence, the names mentioned within the seminar, all of these so-called pseudo-leaders or mini-leaders or imams happen to be either serving a failed revolution or themselves have failed in their own practice. But that's precisely why we need them. The failure in practice is a form of determination that you cannot achieve it in theory. You can fail in theory so much, and you think that you can learn from it, except that that is not the case. But failure in practice is always a dialectical determination toward a better form of practice. So we need an agenda, a matrix of failed imams, failed leaders, who did in fact have great theory, great ideals, and great fidelity to their own concrete backgrounds. Nevertheless, they failed. In fact, the majority of the people, save for a couple in this seminar, have either been mysteriously disappeared, killed, or executed in the course of Iranian history. In a nutshell, for all the above reasons that I have mentioned, our focus is not about successful leaders or revolutions, but only failed ones in the realm of practice. And now, with this a little bit of an introduction, let's start introducing ourselves. But before that, let's have a 5 minutes break, and then it would be great to hear from all of you where you have come from and why you actually took this course. And I'm pretty sure that, now that I have mentioned what this course is about and that its organization is all over the place and so on and so forth, are you still interested in it or not? And if yes, why? Okay, 5 minutes. Any thoughts? Neon?
Yeah, I've plenty of thoughts.
Well, to overcome your shyness, you better start the practice.
Yeah, I
And
better
you're coming very fast.
Yeah, very true, very true. Yeah, there was one thing, in relation to what you were saying in terms of the text that was assigned for this, where I thought it was really, really, interesting that there was a sort of a problem around humanist thesis, transposing the state of struggle between the colonizer and the colonized to a new site. And that, I think it's left open there as to whether that's a kind of, capitalist sort of, site. And that relocates the struggle. And then leaves open this possibility for recuperation of agency or possibility for evolution as a reactive, force, as a kind of ressentiment, force. I thought that was it chimes very much with kind of what I'm doing in my own work, where I'm working and looking at sort of archives that are part of a, colonial resistance in Ireland. So that's quite kind of relevant to what I'm doing. So I just thought that was a really interesting sort of point and an interesting moment there. And I wondered if, if now is the time to ask you to kind of, to expand a little bit more on what exactly is being referred to there in terms of that situation unfolding.
Which situation?
Oh, of this humanist thesis, in the reading that you assigned to us, there's a section within that which refers to in a kind of a diagnostic, really, of Iranian history. And of the kind of problems about the site of revolution and revolutionary agency, where he refers to this kind of situation of and I guess actually the humanist thesis there, we're talking about the kind of concept of universalism,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I had to do yesterday. I did not want to do this, but I think that it's necessary for me to do it every week. I did for the first time translate some Ali Shariati from Farsi to English.
Mm-hmm.
And my God, I always thought that Ali Shariati is a great writer, a great speaker. But for the first time that I'm trying to translate him, I noticed that this man's sentences don't ever end. But so I'm going to, I translated something exactly on this topic.
Mm-hmm.
In the idea of what actually, from an Islamic perspective, but also a universalist perspective, in the sense that Shariati thinks, this is the reason, I mean, Shariati is fundamentally a person who, what you might call to be responding to the information that he has got from his time in Europe, right? Synthesizing it with his own Islamic Iranian background, which absolutely, I would say that he knows less about Christianity, about Marxism, about world affairs than he knows about his own background. He knows absolutely, and he's a magnificent philosopher in that sense, even though he reacts to the idea of philosophy. He knows everything to a great deal about his own background, where he has come from. But nevertheless, it is this text that I just like a portion of it that translated it tries to show that, well, you know, is it really humanism in the sense of the Western agenda, but rather is it humanism in the Islamic agenda? And this is a very tension that is always in Shariati. That even though he's coming from a Western education, so to speak, and tries to sell to Iranian youth a synthesized version of Western humanism, Western rationality, mixed with this strive for developing indigenous revolutionary vocabulary, it has become clear to me that Shariati is, by all definitions, against some of the critics of Shariati, is a universalist, in the proper sense of what in West we call a universalist, right? And his version of humanism ultimately is the idea of what early humanism in the, I don't know, you might say Plato, then you go Descartes, idea of enlightenment, then people like, you know, Rousseau, Robespierre, in fact, you know, Blanqui, Auguste Blanqui, and so on and so forth, that his idea of humanism is the understanding that the human is an unfinished project. He completely understands this. And this is really, I would say, is a tenet of the true humanism, that humanism understood perfectly in a theoretical and practical sense is an unfinished project. The meaning of the human is yet unexplored. Simple as that, practically and theoretically. So Shariati completely takes side with this very idea. Now, the thing is that what would be a response of Shariati to something that he truly believes, namely this version of humanism? It would be Quran's version of the human. And I think that's really important to understand about Shariati, that Shariati is not anti-universalist, ultimately. It's not anti-enlightenment, as so many people, Iranians, so on and so forth, have claimed. He is truly universalist, except that he thinks that universalism, truly understood in the sense of connecting the material conditions of human with the ideals of what human ought to be, which is really the kernel of the old humanism at the beginning of enlightenment. Western civilization doesn't have enough arsenal, enough ammo to make this sort of synthesis, to move from its own concrete history toward a true universalism. I would say that this is how Shariati became popular in Iran in its own context, by showing that only Shia Islam, which is the ruling class ideology of Iranian society of the time, can essentially take this to a concrete revolutionary level as opposed to Europe. But then Shariati, being a really a revolutionary ideologue, he also wants to criticize this idea that no, even Islam cannot do this. For Islam to be able to, synthesize the concerns of the subaltern with the universal concerns of the enlightened, this requires a number of necessary and sufficient criteria. One of them would be the emergence of what he calls the imamate, the Shia leadership, right? The Shia teacher. Another one would be martyrdom, which I will talk about in terms of his idea of red Shiaism versus black Shiaism, the negationist versus the affirmationist, the idea of that resistance is nothing in terms of resisting an idea if it does not have a determinate negation, right? So the idea of determinate negation becomes extremely important for him, and the practical consequence of it. The idea of jihad, the idea of martyrdom, so on and so forth. But ultimately, Shariati we should understand this from a, just as Shariati understood other people, we should understand Shariati is fundamentally a person who hasn't been acquainted sufficiently with Marxist doctrine, with historical materialism. I wouldn't say that this is just the fault of Shariati. I think that even Iranian Marxists of the time didn't know what actually historical materialism is. And this created a certain sort of really internal strife in Shariati, where he is utterly pro historical materialist thesis, right? Emancipation in the Marxian sense and so on and so forth, and how you have to literally calibrate your practices according to those junctures of practice which you consider as, the status quo, the capitalist regime, the mode of the economic basis, the social basis, and so on and so forth. He does that, but he really doesn't have a good grasp of this. This is why I think that Shariati is a blueprint of an imam. He's not an imam. He neither has a great grasp of world religions, nor he has a good grasp of material conditions. And to this extent, his hybridization of Islam and Marxism, which led to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, are kind of grab baggish at the end of the day. They want, in one situation, to move toward more Islamic practices, in another turn of the way, Marxist sort of agendas, and so on and so forth. And because of this, the whole legacy of Shariatism, I would say, is very, very much even though it's humanist, it's universalist at the end of the day, and also indigenous, fundamentally anti-colonial, and anti-imperialist, not in the sense of Sayyid al-Qut or conservative Muslims or traditionalist Muslims like Sayyid Nasr. It still feels as if, you know, it wants to mobilize an Islamic ideology for revolutionary purposes, but without the understanding of how really Islamic ideology, which I am absolutely pro-Islamic ideology from a Marxist perspective, he doesn't know how Islamic ideology can bounce back on the people, on the masses. He hopes that when he, you know, he synthesizes a little bit of Marx, a little bit of anarchism, a little bit of anti-colonialism, a la Franz Fanon, a little bit of social law, a la his teacher, George Gorvich, and so on and so forth. Everything will come together. Still, he thinks in his head. He's, in that sense, an ideologue of the sort that Marx and Engels criticized in German ideology, right? So he thinks that this ideology will bounce back on the masses and then comes back to him in a better sort of understanding of what masses truly want as their destiny. And then he can take it from there and then give it back to the masses. And then this whole circle of positive feedback will eventually create a revolution. Well, it did create a revolution. In fact, Shariati, I would say, is the only ideologue of modern times we know of that instigated a planetary revolution. I don't think that any ideologue or any theorist that we know of has managed to, you know, create such a revolution. No, Shariati did. Except that what sort of revolution? Well, a revolution precisely because of this bouncing back and off of the masses in terms of where the ideology come from and how ideology can, you know, you can give it to the masses and they give you, based on their own material conditions, back their own version of ideology, their own wants and desire back to you, and then you hone it out and then send it back to the masses, and then it comes back, and then, you know, this sort of idea, it didn't happen in the society of Iran during that time. What it brought to the table was a very strange sort of revolutionary paradigm, which is called Khomeiniism. That certain sort of aspects of Shariati's humanism and universalism were preserved for the sake of world revolution and the legitimizing the Iranian revolution, but ultimately Iranian revolution succumbed to a myopic counter-universalist, counter-enlightenment revolution. Of course, Shariati himself had, you know, made a number of you know, criticisms that this transition from, the things that are in your head in terms of the move downward and move upward, translating it to the concrete universality can go wrong. If, for example, if you give the power to a certain sort of religious leadership, clericalism, velayat faqih, so on and so forth. Now, of course, he became massively under criticism of also the Shia clergy. But nevertheless, I would say that Shariati himself didn't exactly know the concrete terms of the transition from that, the ideas which are in your head to the ideas which are tantamount to the practice. And it didn't help for his cause, despite his universalist agendas, to go and create a very myopic understanding of Marxism, some of which are true. I think that some of his criticism of Shariati were absolutely on point, but nevertheless, not all of it. Not only that, this myopic criticism of Marxism, Marxist legacy, historical materialism, but also, worse than that, the criticism of Christianity and Judaism, meaning other sort of universal religions. The version of Islam as the sort of humanist project that he wanted to elevate was mostly, in a lot of his texts actually, is based on abstract negation, not determinate negation, abstract negation of Judaism and Christianity. So even in the ideological sense, which is really his territory, a revolutionary territory, because he always put an emphasis on the revolutionary ideology as something that can bounce back on the masses and they can back to the intellectual, relieve the intellectual from these things that possess his skull, his mind, and bring the intellectual back to the masses and masses back to the intellectual, and so on and so forth, such that ultimately there would be no distinction between the intellectual and masses. He created a number of fundamental mistakes in understanding other religions, other revolutionary ideologies, that unfortunately, I take side here, only here, with critics of Ali Shariati, that Ali Shariati did in fact contribute to the rise of Islamism as we know it today in Islamic Republic of Iran. Truly he did. There was an element of his laxity about such matters coming from, one, his rather elementary primitive understanding of historical materialism and world religions, but also it came from something that I don't know whether it was a fault or rather it was merely just, the necessity of the time, that he just didn't want to piss off, the religious ideology of the time, nor he wanted to essentially give more excuses for Shah to arrest him, the Shah's Sabak. It is famous that Ali Shariati's texts are always have been written in the double tongue. That there is a fundamental practical ambiguity intentionally designed to make these lectures such that he can get away with whatever he says and be not harmed either by Islamic Shia clericalism of the time or by secular, pro-West Shah's Secret Service Sabak. Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, any sort of revolutionary should create a certain sort of vocabulary that allows the revolutionary subject to go undetected. It is absolutely necessary. If you will be detected as a revolutionary by a fundamentally, totalitarian, highly hostile, belligerent system, state, you will be essentially cut off from pursuing your agenda. So Shariati was really fun, and this is something that other people, commentators, haven't talked about Shariati. The Shariati is literally the manifestation of the Shia Imam, the Imam of Ketman, concealed.
Are you saying that there's some language of encoding there, in that strategic ambiguity?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So in other words, it's kind of, is it like a vitalism in a way? Sort of a system kind of, trying to defend itself from some kind of, threat from within it. So it's about the survival of the ideology in a way, but it's also, well, how he sees himself as a revolutionary agent within that, also.
From his practical reasoning of the time, according to the context of his own society, it was absolutely necessary for Shariati to talk in double tongue. By that double tongue, I don't mean it that is polysemous or this and that, but literally in a way, in a pragmatic way, that he can advance revolutionary ideas and revolutionary ideology against the backdrop of not just one oppressor, but two oppressors who are in unconscious complicity with one another. Shia clericalism of the time and monarchy, right? So it's a hard task, for a revolutionary to be undetected. And my God, he did it. He truly did that. He essentially gave a number of lectures. And I have read the reports of Savak on him, where basically earlier on, the Savak, the secret police of Shah, intelligence services, they thought that, well, this guy is not really dangerous. And by the way, I would say when it comes to imams of revolution, past mid-20th century, I don't think that there has been a more dangerous revolutionary than Ali Shariati. Literally, his name is truly a threatening to a number of ruling class ideology. Clerical Shiaism, royalist monarchy, nationalism, Iranian nationalism, and so on and so forth, and colonialism, of course. So for this sort of, so this is not something that I would say that, well, Ali Shariati made a mistake. No, I think that he made a great decision, historical decision, to have that sort of double tongue. That double tongue allowed him to go under the radar of Savak, right, for many years. And then ultimately, Savak, the secret police of Shah, came to this conclusion that, okay, this guy is a troublemaker, but we are not going to interfere and shut down his lectures. Precisely because his essential legacy, his entirety of his lectures are going to be shut down by Shia clerics, meaning that let the religious fanatics take care of him, but not us. Mm-hmm. So they waited, except that it didn't fucking happen. Oh. By the time the Shariati's revolutionary ideology, Islamic ideology, trickled down to the Iranian nation, it was way too late. This was a mistake. And this is, I would say, the same thing about CIA. The CIA does not see certain sort of agents as threats because they literally travel through the sieve that CIA has made for the enemy and the friend. So Shariati literally passed through this sieve. And yes, Savak was absolutely correct. The first time that he actually came under massive sort of attack was not by Savak regime, by the Shah and the monarchy, by the royalists, but by Iranian clerical Shiaism. Certain sorts of, elements of Islamic Shia who believed that no, clerics, namely jurists, have the upper hand in interpretation of Quran, whereas Shariati absolutely did not believe in such a thing. He thought that this simple understanding that you have the upper hand in the interpretation of Quran. When I'm saying Quran, I mean it as a Muslim, that Quran and Islam are one and the same thing. Quran and Islam are one and the same thing. So if someone comes with the interpretation, progressive historical interpretation of Quran, such as Ali Shariati, it comes under the radar of first and foremost the clerical jurists, which he came. And literally, they were the people who put this idea in the Shah's regime that they should close Hosseiniye Ershad, which was a mosque and it still is, where basically intellectuals of highest caliber could actually talk about revolution and Islam. Mm-hmm. So they shut down Hosseiniye Ershad because of Shariati's presence in it as the most popular lecturer. As someone who is just literally, when he talks to people, 16-year-old, 35 years old, from different backgrounds, want to become Muslims because Shariati is a Muslim. not because they know Islam, but because they know Shariati. That was a massive source of threat against the conservative idea of this sort of Islamism or Shia clericalism that was there. And of course, there is a massive sort of complicity between Shia clericalism of the time and essentially monarchy. I mean, of course, monarchism wants always to say that, well, you know, no, Islamism is our enemy. No, monarchism in Iran in the contemporary time is nothing but a parasite of clerical Islamism, has always been. And is really the bane of monarchism in Iran, even though secular Pahlavi dynasty, against which Shariati, you know, voiced his opinions. So yeah, Shariati ultimately was shut down by clerical Islamism. And then later, when they noticed, Savak noticed that what all these lectures are about, that he's both against clericalism and both against monarchy, then yeah, they put him in prison in a solitary confinement. But as always, we know in the revolutionary struggle, the prison is a secret council for revolutionary struggle. Prison is where you are safe to say whatever you want to say. In fact, Iranian revolution was managed, administered, organized from Evin prison, the infamous prison of political prisoners. For 10 years, under the watchful eyes of Savak, CIA trained, and so on and so forth, and Mossad trained. Within the prison, they created the safest secret revolutionary council for dissemination of Islamic Marxism, led by Ayatollah Mahmoud Taleghani, who was a mentor of Ali Shariati. My apologies. Thoughts before I start reading? Yes. Brother, please go on.
Hello, everyone. So I have three different takes on this. First, I first read Shariati 2 years ago in like the biggest identity crisis
In what language? In what language?
in Arabic, in the
In
Arabic
Arabic.
translation. Yeah.
Where are you from, if I may
I'm from
ask?
Morocco.
Morocco, okay.
Yeah, it's from the desert, not. So, as I said, 2 years ago, when in a context, in our the regional context of signing a predictable fake peace in North Africa and Middle East Sunni countries, and now we live in the consequences somehow. So, and in the continuation of what you say about Shariati, his introduction in the Arab talking world by Musa Sadr led to
Imam Musa Sadr, absolutely.
led to the same consequences in mainly in the Arab-speaking countries, but also in some Sunni countries. So we saw, for example, the reaction of some authoritarian regimes even in North Africa and so on.
Let's not forget that Imam Musa Sadr, according to conspiracy theories or documents, was liquidated by
Gaddafi. Yeah. So he had the martyr ending as Shariati had one, I think. So
you know that Shariatism was fundamentally, these were, according to Mahmoud Taleghani, they were elements of secret council of revolution. There were a number of people who were completely associated with Shariatism or Shariati's legacy. Musa Sadr, an Iranian who, Lebanese also. Of course, you know that as an Arab, that when he talks Arabic in Persian accent.
Yeah.
Musa Sadr, Mustafa Chambran, who with Musa Sadr created the Amal movement in Lebanon as a united front against Zionism. And on top of all of these, the only person that I think, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with this person, but nevertheless, I plea you to look more into this person's and his work. Ayatollah Mahmoud Taleghani. So Taleghani was the enabler of Shariati in Iran, because you see, Shariati couldn't have any sort of what you might call to be solid footwork in Iran, given that he had gone to Europe, right? He got a number of his teachings from Sorbonne, from other sort of places. I mean, his teacher, lo and behold, is George Gorvich. And George Gorvich is a no-protonist. It's actually quite interesting. Someone who has written magnificent, really, George Gorvich, if you read some of his works, has written magnificent criticisms of the idea of democracy. This literally influenced Shariati legacy in the idea of that, it needs to be critical of the idea of democracy. You see, just because democracy appears to be democratic, that doesn't mean anything. He had this idea that in tandem with George Gorvich, that the ultimate end here, if we are truly, critical, historically critical, we have to explain why is that democracy has given rise to individualism. Number one. Number two question, can we, and this is George Gorvich's idea, and also Shariati's pseudo-anti-democratic critique, that insofar as we take for granted the foundation of democracy, it is on us as a kind of weight, critical weight, to explain why is that democracy always give rise to individualism? And does it? And does it? This is George Gorvich kind of last question. Does it? And if it does, how much of democracy do we need, really? Can we imagine a future democracy where democracy cannot give rise to, kind of liberal individualism, or always democracy will be in tandem with the individualist legacy? And I think that Shariati got this from him. So many people who accuse of Shariati of anti-democratic, anti-enlightenment, anti-universalist sort of way, they should go back and read his teacher's work, George Gorvich. Ideas and Social Law is a great work to begin with. George Gorvich absolutely is one of the greatest social jurists in Europe during that time. Please go on.
Yeah, so as I said, the introduction of Shariati in the Arab world, I think Arab-speaking world, by Musa Sadr, I think excluded or introduced two main topics of the reflection of Shariati, is the sociological aspects and the Islamiyat, the Islamic, but they didn't introduce, and I think it was the most dangerous, I think, part in Shariati's work is the As-Sahrawiyat in the Arab translation. It's the desert writings. And I think I think I found the first translation of this desert writing of Shariati, and it reminds me of a little paragraph of a Moroccan historian. It's Abdullah Al-Aroui, a great paragraph, but where he says that the history of the North African Sahara, so the desert, is not climatic history or geological history. It's properly political history, because it is the history of those who go to the desert to come back stronger. So they flee to the desert as nomads, and they come back. And then he asked the question, who comes first, the camel or the nomad? So it's, and I think it gives great result to think about Shariati in this way. And it is linked to your seminar, The Draw of the Desert, because
Rather, have you read Kojin Karatani's The Structure of World History?
no, I did not.
Well, I absolutely love you to read this work. It's not as if, this is magnificent, world-changing work, but it's essentially a work that truly formulate, compress, because, ultimately, when we are talking about ideological revolution, we also mean cognitive mapping, and cognitive mapping for the masses. Cognitive mapping is how we can actually compress a description of the world, and how we can compress the explanation of the description of this world, such that there would be a certain sort of practices sufficient for this, duality of description and explanation. And of course, we don't have it yet, right? I would say that read Kojin Karatani. He talks about a number of these issues in his book. It is quite interesting, is of course a Japanese philosopher. He moves from, kind of like different sort of economic basis toward a certain sort of world religion or universal religion, where basically there would be a different sort of exchange, different sort of practices. It's very much in tandem what you are talking about. But of course, Shariati doesn't know anything about this, right? I would say Shariati is fundamentally it's what you might call to be someone who, for the first time in his own context, before Musa Sadr, before Mustafa Chamran, before many of these people, sees that he has come up with certain sort of material, what you might call to be universal ideas of revolution. But also he understands that he has to go back to develop an indigenous parlance of revolution, which I think is absolutely necessary. But nevertheless, he wants to also synthesize all of these together. And then his synthesizing of the universal and the concrete particular comes under his own historical context, which means that it is going to be countered by clerical Islam, by nationalism, by statism, by even, in fact, more than all the other ones, by a certain version of communism, which was present in Iran. So he's essentially trying to attack and preserve this very minimalist idea of revolution against not the empire of capitalism, but a capitalism that has propagated and mutated throughout our world, yours and mine, right? In the sense that this capitalism comes in one shape as clericalism, as one shape nationalism, statism, communist statism, communist nationalism, so on and so forth. We know that. So it is a very certain sort of, you need to have a certain sort of fortitude to withstand all these sorts of reactionary movements. But the thing is that for Shariati, you might ask, is Marxism is going to save him against this real fight, concrete fight, or is it going to be Islam? We can say the same thing about more, actually less so, precisely because Sayyid al-Qutb, Islamic Brotherhood, was more into the idealistic understanding of Islam, reactionary Islam, and so on and so forth. But with Shariatism, we can say that which one is going to take you to the revolution? Is it going to be a reaction to this or reaction to that? And if reaction to the empire or reaction to Islam, and Shariati would say that no, actually I don't need ultimately communism. Because communism, historical materialism writ large, is an assemblage of practices. And this is Shariati's understanding that I can recover the assemblage of these practices, not in communism, not in Marxist doctrine, but in Shia Islam. A Shia Islam here meaning a negative determination of all sorts of ideologies, right? But once he truly mobilized this sort of red Shiaism, which is called the negative determinate, negation of religion itself, Islam itself, was it sufficient for the movement onward to create an Islamic revolution? I think it was. I think it absolutely, Islamic revolution, Islamic Republic revolution couldn't happen without Shariati and people like him. And Shariati was merely the tip of the iceberg. But does that mean that Shariati contributed to the Islamism that came afterwards? Yes, it did, of course. Passively. But does this mean that the Islamic ideology, the anti-colonialist, the anti-imperialist, and in fact, anti-world communist, as proposed by the Soviet Union of the time, could be, blueprints of world revolution? No, they weren't. Shariati knew that. And I think even Sayyid al-Qutb, being an anti-Semite, being a fundamentally conservative person, knew that. No. The material conditions of our society had changed so much that it was, you could go always, this is the legacy of colonialism in the Middle East and Near East. And I'm merely talking about these two regions because I have an immediate knowledge of it, right? I can't talk about Africa, I cannot talk about South Asia and so on and so forth. It was so entrenched that the ultimate revolutionaries paradigms that could come out of these regions were already either very conservative, anti-colonial, such as Sayyid al-Qutb and Muslim Brotherhood, or Shariatism, which I would say is more like this idea of you have one leg in the history and one leg in the possibility of the Messiah yet to come. And of course, both of these, as we have seen, can lead to massive amount of more conservative, more fundamentally, kind of reactionary Islamic ideology. My apologies. One second, I'm coming back. My apologies. So,
Reza, just a reminder that there are 10 minutes left.
sure. So, next session, we are. I know that I asked for you to read Where Shall We Begin by Ali Shariati. This is an earlier text, and it is obviously a kind of an ode to Lenin's What is to be Done. In fact, Ali Shariati later on wrote a text called What is to be Done. The problem here is what I'm going to read for you. What is a revolutionary subject? So, the problem that we are concerning ourselves with regard to revolution, with regard to creating the optimal condition for a subject that when it comes to change, when it comes to justice and freedom, put the emphasis not on theoretical cognitions, but rather practical cognitions. And that's what I call an imam. Requires a certain sort of characteristics, this sort of person, this sort of subject. When I say person, I don't mean it's a person in the canonical sense, because a person is always determined by other persons, and subjectivity as we know it in the Kantian Hegelian sense is always determined by other subjectivities, right? Insofar as subject is only, its specificity can be talked about in terms of its relation with other sort of subjects, namely the others. We can talk about what sort of practical agent, what sort of revolutionary agent are we talking about? When we are talking about synthesizing the concrete context of our own history, where we have come from, and the ideas, the iduses, the essences, the ujia, of where we are heading, no matter where we have come from. Right. So I want to read this translation of Ali Shariati. It's not actually translated in English. That would be set the tone finally for our next session. The next session, we are going to talk about a number of topics. 1, resistance. 2, the will of the people. 3, revolution according to the will of the people. And 3, what is the end game of the will of the people or revolution? Not from the perspective of theoretical ideas, but practical cognitions, right? Practical reasons. phronesis, practical wisdom. And practical wisdom is literally what you might call to be the ultimate deployment of the cognitive machineries, universally, holistically understood, where the cognitive machinery can now be talked about not in terms of the premises, of action, but rather their consequences, which means the sort of organizations which wed the premise of practical action to its consequence. We want to think about revolutionary subjectivity, revolution, and so on and so forth in this sort of way. To differentiate revolution from mere resistance. I know that resistance has become a catchword these days, but I want to say that no, revolution is properly understood is a concrete universalist project, without which there is absolutely no way to move forward in the direction of emancipation, justice, and freedom. It has become obviously clear to all of us that we are living in the age of a suicidal reason, in which not only the reason of capitalism, of justification of its own existence, but the justification of us living in our own existence as this and that has become nothing but suicidal. Suicidal in the sense that it goes hand in hand, silently, with the complete destruction of the planet, of collective will, and most importantly, the idea of a human that could make a difference. Insofar as we have given up this idea, we are in a course which shall be and should be taken very seriously. Nothing comes out of this other than death. And in death, it doesn't matter where you are subaltern, you are Iranian, you are from global south, or you are a capitalist exploiter. You will be all extinguished by the very force to which you have subscribed. This is from Ali Shariati. It is from an untranslated piece which he has entitled خویشتن‌سازی یا خودسازی انقلابی. خویشتن in Farsi means nafs al-insaniya, meaning the essence of the human, meaning to cultivate, to improve a certain sort of organization, a certain sort of Bildung, a certain sort of making that makes this shine forward as the blueprint of all other practices. خویشتن‌سازی انقلابی, revolutionary self-sculpting. The meaning of self-sculpting is not that, like ascetics, monks, and religious worshippers have said, being discrete from others, being separated from others, discrete from time, and discrete from all the relationships which both are and ought to be between oneself and society. That is oneself, an account of a relation to oneself, based on imaginary, mental, hereditary, sectarian, and ethnic values, or special ideals that exist in a spiritual and Sufi ethics, or considering self-cultivation or self-improvement as the Marxists do only as a means to prepare ourselves in taking part in a political movement of the time. Rather, at the same time, self-cultivation or self-sculpting consists of raising oneself revolutionary as a principle and an authenticity and a goal. That is to say, developing one's individuating essence, whose prerequisite is participation in the destiny of the people, which our humanity and existential evolution demands and necessitate. Engaging in self-sculpting requires acknowledging these following principles. 1. The human plays a role in its own historical path in changing its social system. By this, we do not mean personality worship, leader worship, idolatry, and individualism, all of which are infidelity, kufr in Islamic parlance, polytheism, shirk, and malice, afat, pest, but rather conviction in the human's consciousness and will, and regarding it as a cause in the path of scientific determinism of history and social evolutions, which are undoubtedly based on scientific standards and material causes and factors, which is itself the relationship between the human and nature. 2. In a social revolution, humans cannot remain honest, confident, and faithful to the end unless they have made themselves a revolutionary before and in synchronicity with the struggle itself. Principally, a revolutionary human being is not merely defined as a human participates in a social revolution, for it is possible that opportunists, adventurists, and selfists also take part in it, which they do. And these are the very germs of the deviation of all movements and the failure of all revolutions. Yes, first and foremost, a revolutionary is an evolved, self-made essence. It is a human being who has systematically replaced the traditional and instinctively inherited self with an ideologically self-made sense. Self. 3. The human, both in the sense of the individual and collective, is not always and absolutely born out of and nurtured by the environment. By environment, I mean both the natural environment, as naturalists rely on it, and the geographical and climatic environment, as geographers talk about it, and the historical environment, as historicists believe, and the social environment, as sociologists rely on it, and also the environment in the sense of a class environment, as Marxists articulate. The human is not also a mere deterministic creature of hereditary and genetic characteristics, as biologists, fascists, and racists believe. At the same time, we also do not want to negate all these social, material, and class factors and constraints. But in proving all of this as somehow true, context sensitively, we also believe that the human can be its own creation. That is to say, be a participant and a shareholder of its own building. Yet this belief should not lead us to a kind of idealism either, especially one that infects us with a mystical and sentimental philosophical romanticism, which most utopia makers speak of and think of man as an isolated essence, discrete from the environment of nature and society and historical compulsions. For the human is born of nature and nurtured by its history, society, and class, and is also affected by natural, biological, and even genetic conditions and constraints. However, the path of the human being's existential evolution moves in the direction of its freedom from these scientific and materially compulsive factors. And to the extent that its will and self-consciousness mature, the human shifts from that which is merely caused to a cause itself, from disability to ability. Therefore, when we say the human, we mean the emergence of that cause that plays the role of a self-conscious agent, creator, producer, designer, and employer in the course of nature and history. And such a human, to the extent that it mobilizes its will with self-consciousness and natural and material knowledge, it can set itself up to rule the material and scientific path of its own history. As we see with regard to nature, the human changes nature with scientific work. Here we mean a work accompanied by science or experience. And in the same vein that it transforms its social system into the system it desires, with a social ideology, the human can also make a human it wants to be by working on its own self. It is from here that self-making, like society building and like nature building, is a scientific objective act. At the same time, a human vocation. The Quran's take on the human is concordant with this view. The Quran considers the human not as an abstract, an absolute idea outside of the material system and objective and scientific causes and constraints, and not simply as an unconscious phenomenon that occurs in the compulsive sequence of history or nature or hereditary. Surah 13. لقد خلقنا إنسان في أحسن التقويم ثم رددناه أسفل السافلين. We have created the human in its best stature, then we return it to the lowest of low. And this is kind of like a expanded translation of this verse in Surah 13 in Quran by Shariati. We created the human in the highest scientific measure in talent and the possibilities of evolution. Then we brought him back to the lowest level of the low. Shariati thinks of this as really what the human means to be. Human is nothing but a test. What is this test about? By way of a work, hayya ala falat, hayya ala salat, or different way, hayya ala salat, hayya ala falat, calling to the prayer, calling to the good work. And salat simply in Quran, as some people have mentioned, interpreters, means revolutionary work, as opposed to mere prayer. Revolutionary practice and working practice. Work meaning in the sense of, as a human, you have to work in order to sustain yourself. So what sort of practices are you going to abide with, right? And in that sense, this is a test that Quran, or rather what, as we are going to talk about, Kojin Karatani has called mode D of exchange, meaning a gift without reciprocation, transcended beyond the state nationalism, which is the hallmark of universal religion. Ultimately, comes back to this very message that yes, there is infinite potentiality to the human, that the meaning of the human is fundamentally unexplored, because there is no fundament or essentialist substance behind it. It is merely that of the level of not Kantian possibility, but of practical freedom, namely transcendental enterprise. The more you criticize conditions of possibility, of what make you objective norms and practices about history, the more you can make different practices that change the course of your history, and thus you achieve the very fact of a spirit, that the spirit is nothing but what it does. It is what it does, right? Practical, reason, understood as absolute, concrete freedom. And to that extent, this is Shariati's understanding of the Quranic verse in Surah 13, where basically Islam has this understanding of the human as ultimately Tawhidi, meaning godly, by its very definition, that human is God itself. Except for it to prove that it is a God, it needs to prove it practically. And hence, it needs to be cast down to its own biological substrate, such that it can bootstrap itself from it.
Reza, sorry to interrupt. Can you finish your speech? We're reaching the record
I am
soon.
done. I am done. I am done.
Nice.
So one more thing, that Surah 13 is a very strange sort of surah in Quran. These are parts of a number of surah or chapters which are called divine oaths, in which God does not actually in which the oaths are not made in the name of humans, but it's the divine that makes oaths in the name of humans. It's very interesting that these are considered to be the ultimate, what you might call to be the pinnacles of Wahy, which means the transference of God's edict to the human. Except that these are made always, these surahs, which are a handful of them, Surah Al-Adiyat, Surah Al-Nazi'at, Surah Al-Fajr, Surah Al-Tin, and so on and so forth. These are made in God's own divine oath, where basically human is brought to the center stage, its freedom is brought to the center stage, such that any sort of deviation from this freedom, from the justice of the human, requires a punishment that has been promised historically. As the result of deviation from the freedom of the human, to which Allah is swearing. And these are usually start with wa. You know, لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا وَالْتِينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ. Swear by fig and olive on Mount Sinai. وَالْفَجْرِ وَلَيَالِ الْعَشْرِ. By dawn and every other night. وَالْعَادِيَاتِ ضَبْحًا. By those horses of the freedom fighters galloping in the dawn, ambushing the enemies of freedom, and so on and so forth. And then these are very rhythmic, highly, extremely poetic, and then suddenly the Quran verses changes to extremely punishing, very, very kind of nitty-gritty sort of admonishment of that if you deviate from this formula of human freedom, this is going to happen to you. And this is one of this. لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي الْأَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ السَّافِلِينَ. Right? Another one which Shariati always talks about, Surah Al-Taqasur, Al-Hawkum Al-Taqasur. Those who excessively desire to gain more will make their own grave and ultimately will end up in that grave. It is very much this is how Shias have interpreted this in the course of contemporary Iran, that Surah Al-Taqasur is essentially a surah about capitalism. That there is nothing to capitalism other than its own accelerationist, escalatory demand for more, which ultimately it will make a graveyard of itself, not in a teleological sort of way that capitalism will end up dead because of its will for the more, but precisely because its will to the more creates a revolution that ultimately digs, the grave of the capital. And I will talk about this as we move forward in terms of Shariati and the legacy of the Islamic Republic, the failure and the victories of the Imam in the vein of ideological revolution. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Reza. Thank you, Reza. Great.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend.
It's a great coincidence. A friend was translating Ali for Portuguese recently.
I will definitely, if you have a translation of your friends of Ali Shariati, definitely send it to me. He's actually, the more I have read different sort of Ali Shariati's, different period, actually everyone says that he's very good writer, that he always wanted to connect with the masses and the people. He's not really that great of a writer. He does, yeah. He's a very difficult, actually, writer.
Yeah. He was translating a text called Red Shoes and Black Shoes, something like that.
This is, I will talk about this. This is the Red Shiaism, Black Shiaism. So next session, number of you need to get together and make a PowerPoint presentation about Ali Shariati. I will leave it to you who is going to do this and what parts of Ali Shariati's thought you are going to bring to the foreground.
Okay.
But I have actually shared the text, Where Shall We Begin, which is a magnificent text earlier on written in Shariati's thing. Another text that I have suggested is Selection or Election. Another text that I want to essentially put forward is Abu Zar. So Abu Zar al-Ghaffari, a companion of Muhammad, is considered to be the first, apart from Ali, who converted to Islam on his own accord, out of his own ideological convictions, which had nothing to do with Islam, was Abu Zar. And Abu Zar is considered to be according to Shariati, the prototype of a communist, a socialist warrior, who under no condition will essentially submit or capitulate to the status quo. That is also a great, great text by Shariati, precisely because it shows what sort of communism, what sort of, in Kojin Karatani's words, universal religion, emancipatory universal religion, does Shariati want from the whole legacy of Shiaism in Iran.
Thanks, Hazar.
Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you, Reza.
Bye-bye.